What's up guys, Grandmaster Igor Smirnov is here, and today I'd like to share with you the 6 powerful opening traps after the first move pawn to e4. We'll start from a fairly simple thing which happens in the Caro-Kann defense, and right after that we'll also move into a much more advanced level things which are really useful and I'm sure are unknown to a lot of your opponents. Again, we'll start from a fairly simple one, but then we'll have some really cool stuff. So here's the starting position of the Caro-Kann defense, and the standard move for white here is knight to c3. However, you can also play bishop to d3, which also makes perfect sense. You're protecting the pawn and developing a piece. And right here there are a few things black can do. Obviously he can capture the pawn, which would be the correct move. But in this case, we'll take a look at what happens if black goes knight to f6. By the way, before we dive into that operation, let me just quickly mention that if black captures the pawn and play knight f6, you just retreat with your bishop to f3. After that, you play knight to e2, and even if your opponent is aware of the trap, nothing bad happens to you. You continue your development as usually, go knight to c3, you castle, and everything's good. You just keep playing the normal position. So there's clearly nothing wrong that can happen for you here. But let's take a few steps back and see what happens if black goes knight f6, which also seems like a move which does make a lot of sense. In this case, you push your pawn firstly to e5 and then on the next move to e6. It is a very common sacrifice, very common tactical pattern, which is certainly worthwhile to know and to remember. It may occur in various different opening positions, not only in the particular one which we can see right now on the screen. And the point here is you're deflecting that pawn from the f7, which is covering the king, and after that you can attack the black's king from this angle, queen h5, and all of a sudden black is done. Yes, that's it, even though it's just the 6th move, but black is done. The only thing he can do is to play pawn to g6, but then you can grab this pawn with the bishop or the queen, and after that we have this beautiful finish. The first trap was quite known, and yet still people fall into this trap. But the next ones that I'm about to share with you just right now are really cool. A lot of them are unknown. I was really surprised when I, for instance, saw the current one, which I'm about to show you right now. It's a really cool one. We'll also take a look at the examples when even legendary players such as Vishy Anand or Garry Kasparov lost really badly right in an opening stage because they couldn't figure out how to deal with these traps. Alright, anyway, let's go ahead with the trap number 2. It happens after the first very standard moves, e4, e5, knight f3, knight of c6, one of the most classical opening moves you can only think of. And here, white can play a move bishop e2, which you would never guess can be a beginning of a trap, and yet it is. Right here, black can play bishop to c5, which seems like one of the most natural things to play, and yet I would actually say that this is a mistake, and it already compromises black's position significantly, because even after the very best play after that, black is in some sort of disadvantage, and very often he will just lose immediately. Now, once again, it's when I first saw this trap, I was really amazed. I never thought that such a timid move as bishop e2 could trap black into something really cool. Alright, so the idea here is to take knight takes e5. Notice that it is not really a sacrifice, because after black recaptures, you play pawn to d4, you attack simultaneously 2 of the minor pieces, and therefore you'll take one of them back. But the cool thing about this trap is that it's not really that easy for black to somehow just maintain the material balance without compromising his position in any other way. For example, if he takes bishop takes d4, may seem like the simplest solution for black. You recapture, and all of a sudden black realizes that he cannot move this knight away, because you will then just grab that pawn on g7. And even if he tries to protect it by playing pawn to d6, you just play pawn to f4, and you push this knight to go back, and after that you'll still grab the pawn, right? So you're grabbing the pawn, you're attacking the rook, so at the very least you want a pawn, which already gives you a significant advantage. Pretty cool. I'm sure you can win a number of games, just like that. Now, let's take a few steps back and try to figure out if there's anything else that black can possibly play. Alright, I'm coming back to this position. white just played pawn to d4, and black needs to figure out how to protect one of his pieces. We just discovered that bishop takes d4 does not help. What if he tries bishop to d6? And then you recapture, bishop takes e5. At the moment, the material balance is equal, but you gained initiative. You can now play pawn to f4, taking the bishop. It goes back probably to f6. After that, you can push your pawn to e5 right away, or you can even castle, which I prefer a bit more. It's a little more flexible here. You save different opportunities in the future. You're still threatening him to, play pawn to e5, so he'll probably play pawn to d6. Now you can go knight to c3, which in some variations may aim to jump to d5 and attack the bishop. And if black goes knight e7, which is the most natural move to play, all of a sudden white can crush black immediately. I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. It can be like a little tactical warm-up for you. Can you find the winning shot for white here? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it, and if you can't find it, please write it down in the comments below, and let's then compare your findings with what can actually happen here. The winning shot for white is pawn to e5. The central thrust breaks through the black's defense, and then after pawn takes e5, you trade the queens, and you play rook d1. And all of a sudden, even though it is an endgame, and you do not really expect some powerful attack in endgame, but in this case, this is exactly what happens. Black has to go king to e8. He can't play bishop d7, covering the king, because in this case, you just play bishop g4 and you take advantage of the pin. So on the next move, you will inevitably grab the bishop, probably with your rook, devastating black. Therefore, bishop d7 doesn't help. But what about king goes to e8? In this case, you just go knight to b5, and you're ready to grab the pawn, attack the king, attack the rook, and if king goes to f8, you will even finish him off by playing rook to d8. And therefore, here once again, black is losing right away. Now let me show you the best defense for black against this trap number 2. So after these first opening moves, you go bishop e2, and if he plays bishop c5, then you have this sudden blow, knight takes e5. And one of the best things that black can possibly do is to take bishop takes f2, and then after that he recaptures your knight. Once again, currently the material balance is equal, but the good thing that happened is that you gained 2 bishops advantage. And in this position, you may worry a little bit about an exposed position of your king, but there is a very good way to fix this thing. You can play a rook to f1, which prepares this artificial castling. Your king is ready to go to g1, which will create the standard position of a castling, and you save a really good position. Let's say he goes knight f6, trying to capture your pawn. Obviously, you can just protect it by playing knight c3, so that does not really bother you at all. And then on the next moves, let's say he plays d6 or something else, you can push your pawn to d4, which gives you this very nice pawn center, and also it kicks off the knight. And after that, you play king to g1 to finalize your artificial castling. And if you take a look at the position, you can notice that even though the material is equal, you have a lot of good things here. You have 2 bishops, you've got strong pawn center, potentially this pawn is always ready to go to e5 and start attacking. Your bishop is ready to go to g5, putting some pressure and creating this pin. Your rook is very active on this semi-open file, and I would say that you are just having a really great position here. Even though it's not exactly winning, but you are certainly having some advantage here. That's why it's a really cool trap. You can remember this and implement this in your games today or anytime you're going to play your games next time. And by the way, if you enjoy these traps, then consider subscribing to the channel, because I'm also planning on one more video where I'm going to share with you some of my best traps that I know that are unusual and that can easily help you to win a number of games. The next trap is interesting because the black player was Vishy Anand, the legendary Indian chess champion, and yet in this case he lost in 6 moves, which is certainly a very rare case in Anand's career, as well as in general in chess. It's fairly hard to lose in 6 moves, and yet this is exactly what happened. So let's find out how you can use this trap. It happens in the Petrov's defense. So far we're having all the book moves, And in this position, white plays knight to c3. The usual response for black is knight to c3, or I should say the correct response for black. But in this game, Anand played bishop f5, which seems like even a better option. Normally bishop f5 should be a better option, but in this particular case it does not work due to tactical reasons. White can play queen to e2, taking advantage of the pin and threatening to grab the knight, and it may seem like there is nothing bad happening for black, because he can do the same thing by playing queen to e7 and covering the king, so there is no pin anymore, as well as it protects the knight, and therefore it looks like black is just maintaining the balance and everything's good. But here comes knight to d5, attacking the queen, and at this point black realizes that he's in trouble. The knight is attacking the queen as well as the pawn on c7. Therefore, black has to move the queen somewhere, let's say to d7. But now, white can take advantage of the pin once again. He plays pawn to d3, and on the next move, there's nothing black can do against pawn takes the knight, which gives white clear material advantage and an immediate win. Actually, in the real game, after white played queen e2, a few moves back, so Anand resigned right here, actually, in the game, which probably makes it the shortest game in Anand's career, and definitely a trap which is worth remembering for us, so that you can either use it as white or at least don't fall a victim of the trap if you're playing black. And here we go with the trap number 4. It is also short and sweet. Happens in the Scotch game after pawn to d4 and this exchange. Here at this point, black can play queen to h4, and it's actually one of the main lines in this Scotch game, and it does make some sense. Black is gonna grab the pawn and attack the knight, and therefore, after white protects the pawn, which is necessary, black plays bishop to c5, kind of trying to trick you into scholar's mate, with this moves like bishop c5 and queen h4. He's kind of trying to make you remove your knight so that he can then just checkmate you right away. And therefore, clearly, that is not what you should do if you're playing white. Gotta be careful and play bishop to e3. You're protecting the bishop, protecting the knight on d4, and here, black can play the natural move knight to e7, even though it is already a decisive mistake. In this case, black is inviting you to grab the knight on c6 once again, because here there is a trap. Clearly, black is not gonna take the knight back. In this case, you would grab the bishop and win the bishop. But instead, black is ready to play bishop to e3, taking advantage of this pin. And therefore, here actually black gets a pretty solid advantage. But that's not what you want to do. Instead of knight takes c6, you have a winning move, knight to f3. Usually, white plays knight f3 in the second move, or the first move even of the game, but in this case it has a much greater power. You're attacking the queen and simultaneously the bishop, and all of a sudden it turns out that black cannot save his bishop, because after queen h5 he can play g4 and finally force the queen to go away and to stop protecting the bishop. Therefore you deflect the queen, and then after it takes the g4 pawn, you just grab the bishop for nothing, or for a pawn I should say, but clearly that gives you a winning advantage. By the way, the current game that I'm showing you right now was played between two grandmasters. The black player, I guess, was an international master at the time, but anyway, it just goes to show you that you can trap even a very strong opponent into this trap. Oh, we've got two final traps for this video, and actually one of them was the trap which was used against Garry Kasparov, and he lost badly. But now let's take a look at another one which also happens in the Caro-Kann defense. So here let's say white goes knight c3, the main line, and then black takes an e4, white recaptures, black plays knight to d7, which is also one of the main lines. And there white has this interesting move knight to g5, which at first may seem like some weird amateur mistake, but it does make sense, and it's actually not that easy for black to cope with it, because from here the knight puts pressure on those critical squares f7 as well as e6, which are often the squares where you can start the devastating attack against an opponent's king. And in this case, white is also ready to support the attack, and we'll see now how it can possibly happen. Let's say black plays pawn to h6, trying to kick this knight off right away. In this case, the knight certainly is not going to go back. Rather, you can play knight to e6. You're attacking the queen. Also, notice that certainly black cannot take the knight because of queen h5 checkmate. Well, black will play g6, but after that, this is a checkmate. Oh, that's already one cool thing that you can possibly use. In this game, which we are analyzing right now, it was played between Anand and Garry, two very strong grandmasters. Black played queen a5 check to escape with the queen, and after bishop d2, he played queen to b6. And now it may seem like white faces a little bit of troubles, because the knight is still hanging, the b2 pawn is under attack, so it may seem like black found some interesting way to cope with the situation, but white is not going to retreat with the knight. He plays bishop d3. Another fairly common tactical motif. You are offering this knight as a sacrifice because you believe that your further attack will be worth it and will be super effective. In this case, black took the knight, and all of a sudden it turns out that it enables white to perform a really cool tactical operation. You can actually think about it for a second, and if you can find it, let me know in the comments below how would you play here as white. The winning shot is really cool. White plays queen h5 check, and after king goes to d8, you continue with bishop to a5, taking advantage of the pin. And therefore you're winning the queen and you're getting the decisive material advantage right away. It is really cool to see that white has these two pieces standing on the edge of the board and helping each other to win an opponent's queen. A very unusual tactical motif and a really cool one. As a final note for this trap, let me just mention that actually, here's the interesting thing about this position. In the current position, clearly you need to use that queen h5 and bishop a5 trap, which I just shown to you. But it's worthwhile to remember that with the current structure, the black's position is actually quite bad in terms of harmony of his pieces as well as defense, and therefore in the current position you could just finish him off. But even without queen h5 and bishop a5 thing, white's position is still pretty good, even though white sacrificed the knight, but he has a lot here to that can possibly compensate this sacrifice of a knight. There is this weak diagonal, so you can play bishop g6 or queen h5. Black has all these weaknesses, and you can use that. Let's say your knight can go there, possibly to f4, to e6 or g6, and also because of this pawn on e6, black cannot develop his pieces normally, and therefore I would say that even without winning the black's queen, so I mean in some other variations, let's say, right, which we didn't cover in this video, you can still play something similar and you will still get a very good position. Congratulations for making it thus far. We have the final 6th trap for this video, and this is the game between Short and Garry Kasparov, and the game was really short. It was the king's gambit, pawn to f4, black captures the pawn, and here comes bishop to c4. Technically speaking, this is not a trap, it's just one of the opening lines, but it is a fairly tricky thing because you are inviting black to play this queen h4 check. Unlike the usual lines where white plays knight f3, which is the main move and which your opponents are probably aware of, here they would play something like pawn to d5, and the game goes on. It's a standard opening variation, your opponent is probably aware of it. But when you play bishop to c4, it's a much trickier thing. You invite black into playing queen h4 check, attacking your king, and you go king to f1. And at the moment, it may seem like, everything is just great for black. You just grab that pawn on f4. He played queen h4, forcing your king to go so that he can't castle anymore. It looks like everything is just great for black, but in reality, it's actually can be much harder for black, because you're ready to play knight f3 attacking the queen. You're ready to push your pawn to d4, having a strong center. Your bishop from c1 can take back that pawn on f4, and within just a few moves, it kind of unrolls for you, and all of a sudden, black may appear in big troubles. Even Garry Kasparov couldn't really sort out, the difficulties of the position, and he couldn't figure out how he should play. He played pawn to b5. He wanted to somehow sacrifice the pawn and maybe fight for initiative. White took the pawn, black played knight f6, here comes knight f3, taking the queen. So here black already realizes that his queen h4 check move has some disadvantages as well. The queen goes back to h6, white plays knight to c3, and black played pawn to g5. It's fairly natural for black to play a move like this in this position, because, you know, without it, white is ready to play pawn to d4, and there is this unpleasant situation for black where your bishop from c1 is somewhat looking at the queen, the pawn f4, and you can obviously keep bringing more and more pieces to attack the pawn. So yeah, black want to play g5 to protect the pawn on f4 so that he doesn't lose it. Also, maybe in some variations he hopes even to push it further so that he can attack you. White plays pawn to d4. That's another advantage of this gambit for white. We're having strong center. Kasparov played bishop to b7. And here comes pawn to h4. This is the way for you to undermine this pawn chain and then to, you know, win some of these pawns, as well as to bring your rook from h1 into play. That's also something cool. Garry played rook to g8. Notice that white can't take the pawn right now because, you know, the rook is pinned. The pawn is pinned, I should say. So white played king g1 to protect the rook, and now h takes g5 is a real threat. Therefore, black took on h4 himself. White recaptured with a rook, attacking the queen, bringing the rook into play. Black plays queen to g6, threatening queen takes g2 checkmate. So obviously you gotta be careful. Queen e2, and you know, here black realizes that, you know, there's some big troubles with him. White is ready to grab the pawn. Knight e5 maybe is coming in some variations. Pawn can go to e5, like. But, you know, the very first thing that white is going to do is just to grab the pawn. And he has the strong center, and therefore, all of a sudden, black appears in a really difficult position. Kasparov decided to grab the pawn so that if he's suffering, at least he'll have an extra pawn. But it didn't work either. White recaptures this case with the rook, attacking the knight as well. So black played pawn to f5 to save the knight. But there comes knight to h4, attacking this time the queen as well as the pawn. And there Garry played queen g3, but then knight takes e5, and in this position black just resigned. Because if he recaptures, there are actually many things that white can do. Probably he'll take here, recaptured by the queen. This is not a sacrifice because white is ready to grab that rook on a8. Currently this is check, and if black goes like bishop e7 or whatever, there are a lot of things that white can do. You can grab the rook right away, or you can play knight f5 or bishop f4. Maybe you can first play knight f5 and then grab the rook. It could be even stronger for white, but, you know, all in all, it is clearly winning, and Kasparov just resigned. It just goes to show you how, you know, powerful this opening line can be if even Garry Kasparov could not figure out the right continuation for black. Let me also mention that if you're interested, you can download the PGN file with all 6 opening traps shown in this video by following the link presented below the video, as well as you can find some additional resources that can help you strengthen your chess game. Finally, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and to subscribe to the channel for more videos that are going to be released very soon, so that you don't miss on them. You can subscribe right now. I wish you have a great rest of the day, and I'll talk to you soon.